my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Our God, our strength, and our Redeemer. I'm going to start this morning by asking a quick question. Those of you who were here last Sunday, show of hands, how many of you enjoyed the two jokes that I started the sermon with? Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. The bad news is I'm going to tell some more jokes. The good news is there's only one. So there was this fellow, and he got stuck up on his roof. You may have heard this one, but if you have, just bear with me. He got stuck up on his roof during a flood, and he started praying to God, God, please save me from this flood. And a couple of minutes later, a guy in a rowboat rose up, and he says, hey, come on down from the roof, get in the boat, I can take us to safety. And the guy on the rooftop shouts back at the guy in the rowboat, and he says, hey, I'm fine, I'm praying to God, God's going to save me. The guy in the rowboat said, okay, and he kept rowing on. So a little time goes by, and the guy in the motorboat pulls up, and he hollers at the guy on the roof, hey, come on down, I can take you to safety. And the guy on the roof waves him off, and he says, no, I'm fine, I'm praying to God, God's going to save me. So the guy in the motorboat says, well, okay. So he keeps going. And a while later, a Coast Guard helicopter flies over and drops a rope down to the roof. And the guy in the helicopter shouts down, grab the rope, we'll take you to safety. And the guy on the roof waves him off again. He says, no, I'm fine. I'm praying to God. God's going to save me. And after a couple of minutes, the guy in the helicopter says, okay. And the helicopter flies off. A couple of minutes later, this big wave washes by, and he washes the guy off the roof, and he drowns. And he's standing in front of God at the pearly gates, and he says, God, I was praying to you. Why didn't you come and save me? God looks at the guy and he says, I sent you a rowboat, a motorboat, and a helicopter, for crying out loud. What more do you want? I think our gospel passage is kind of like that this morning, in that there's different ways God reveals himself to us in this world. In the joke, God was there in the rowboat. God was there in the motorboat, the helicopter. In our gospel passage this morning, we see God revealed in the transfiguration of Jesus. But before we get too deep into the transfiguration, we've taken a pretty big jump from where we've been working for the season after the Epiphany. If you'll recall, over the last month or so during the season, our gospel passages have come from chapter 5 of Matthew's gospel. And we've really been digging into the Sermon on the Mount. Now, unfortunately, because of the way Easter falls this year, we miss the next 3 weeks of the Sermon on the Mount. But I think that's okay. So, where are we up until now? So, if you recall, Matthew wrote this gospel. Matthew was likely a Jewish leader in the synagogue. He probably wrote this gospel sometime toward the end of the 1st century. So Jesus had died and been resurrected, and the Jewish followers of Jesus in this particular synagogue were probably getting a little bit antsy that he hadn't come back yet. So Matthew's writing this gospel to reassure these followers of Christ in the synagogue that Jesus is real. Jesus is and was the Messiah. Jesus will come again. So that's kind of the backdrop for the writing of Matthew's gospel. And if you'll also remember, Matthew, being a good Jew, was very concerned with the Old Testament prophecies. Matthew was very concerned with making sure that Jesus' messiahship and Jesus' lineage really lined up with what they had learned in the Torah, in the law of Moses. We see a lot of imagery. We talked about this over the last couple of weeks. Matthew portrays Jesus as kind of a second Moses. So up until this point, Jesus has called the disciples. He's done his Galilean ministry. He's healed, he's preached, he's fed the 4,000 in Matthew's gospel. He's gone to the Decapolis and preached to the Gentiles. He's really starting to stir things up. And we jump now to chapter 17. Now it's significant. Right before we get to this passage in Matthew's gospel, Jesus and the disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, right before this. And at the time, Caesarea Philippi was kind of a big city, if you will. There was a lot of Jews there. There was the synagogue, but there was also a lot of Greeks and Romans, a very Gentile-influenced area. They had a lot of temples to other gods. And on the way to Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, if you remember the story, Peter, the impetuous one, jumps right in. And he says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." I love Peter. I identify with Peter because Peter kind of shouts things out before he really has a chance to think about them. But Peter's also right a good portion of the time when he does that. Right before he's wrong. And that's what happens to Peter. So Peter identifies Jesus correctly as the Messiah. And then Jesus goes on to tell Peter and the disciples what it's going to mean to follow Jesus. This is where Jesus tells the disciples and us, to be my follower, you have to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. So think about it. Jesus has been revealing himself throughout Matthew's gospel. Jesus has revealed himself in the miracles. Jesus has revealed himself in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has revealed himself as the living law. Remember, he said last week, I have come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus has been constantly revealing himself. And right before this passage, Jesus tells us again how hard it's going to be his follower. And then we get to today's passage. 6 days later, again, an homage by Matthew back to the 6 days that Moses spent on Mount Sinai waiting for God. And then Jesus is transfigured before them. Now, who's with him? Peter, James, and John. I like to think that Peter, James, and John is Jesus' executive committee of the disciples. They're the ones that he calls on for the really important stuff. So Peter, James, and John are there. Matthew gives us this homage, and then Jesus is transfigured. He becomes glowing white, just like Moses. And then a voice out of the cloud. This is my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Back to his baptism. The same words God spoke at Jesus' baptism. But then God adds something else. Listen to him. Why would God need to tell the disciples to listen to Jesus? This is proof for the disciples. This is proof that Jesus is the Messiah, that God is revealing himself in ways that they can only dream about. But God tells the disciples to listen to Jesus. This particular part in Matthew's gospel serves as a turning point, I think. When Jesus, Peter, James, and John are on the top of this mountain, they can see back, figuratively speaking, to where they've already been. They can see Jesus revealing himself in the small miracles. They can see Jesus revealing himself in the teaching, the healing, the feeding, the caring, the bringing in those that have been marginalized. Jesus is revealing himself through all of these things. But Jesus is also revealing himself when they look forward, when they come down off of that mountain. Because what are they looking forward to figuratively from this mountain? They're looking toward another mountain. And that mountain is called Golgotha. When Jesus and the disciples come down off of this mountain, they begin their journey to Jerusalem. They begin their journey to Jesus' death and resurrection. We too will be beginning a journey here in a couple of days. In a couple of short days, with Ash Wednesday, we will begin our Lenten journey one more time. As we begin that Lenten journey, let us remember that God reveals himself in miraculous ways in prayer. But God also reveals himself in the everyday life that we live. When Jesus, Peter, James, and John come down out of the mountain, they continue to do the work God calls all of us to do. They come down off the mountain into the valley, if you were. And in that valley is the hard work of living out God's call in our lives. Coming down off of that mountain into that valley is where we do the work of God. Now, it's not as spectacular as that mountaintop experience. It's not as fun. You can't stay there. Jesus tells Peter, no, don't build tents. You can't stay here. You got to go down into the valley. Sisters and brothers, as we begin our Lenten journey in a few short days, may all of us be comforted by the fact that God